of the church and the saints he raises up and the gives these saints. You know, a lot of you might be doing the consecration that we started on Monday, and as you read that book, you'll learn more about Saint Therese and kind of the insight she was given. In this case, I chose another saint, one who's known for his work on the Rosary, but actually has a lot to teach us in other areas, and that's Saint Louis de Montfort. One of his most important books, although most of us have probably never even heard of it, are not his Rosary books as good as they are. It's called The Love of Eternal Wisdom. It's a little book. You can find it online for free. And what he does is he basically takes this statement in James about the wisdom that comes from above. So he writes a whole book on a commentary from verse 13 of chapter 3 to verse 4 of chapter 4. So he writes a whole book on a commentary to that. And what he does is he's able to take the whole sort of background to Christianity and sort of put it in context. And so I've done this a lot of times, but I'll still kind of touch on it. You know, he goes back, and remember, James mentions 3 types of evil, you know, of this wisdom: earthly, unspiritual, demonic. And the first thing he does is he goes back to Eden, right? You have the threefold excuse or justification for sin. First, Eve says it was good for food. That's a bodily thing. It was pleasing to the eyes. That's a Hebrew euphemism. It's really that which is glittering. So it's a euphemism for wealth, for greed. And so that's the soul, which, remember, the soul is like the mind and emotions, because that's a deeper feeling than just senses. And then finally, it was desirable for wisdom. And that's really the spirit, because wisdom is a spiritual gift and it connects with our human spirit. So that's the 3 ways that Eve sort of justifies her sin. And so everything becomes sort of broken down at that point. And what we find throughout the whole of the human history of at least of the chosen people, is that every time that God attempts to sort of increase us in our love of Him and kind of lift us up to a new level, there's always the same problem. So you move ahead, and then you come to the story of Moses, right, and what's going on there. So Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and what are they doing down below? At the very minute he's getting the 10 Commandments, they're making a golden calf. So this particular temptation is any kind of physical temptation. We generally, when we use the term lust, we generally think of sex, but it's broader than that. Any desire just for physical comfort and pleasure, food, drink, etc. In an abnormal way, you know, not normally we have those things and God made them to be pleasurable. Similarly, this one is a mental, emotional one. And then this one is a spiritual or transcendent one. So we have these 3 issues. Well, if you look at the golden calf, in one object, the calf represents the threefold sin, right? He's a symbol of fertility. That's what they were in the ancient world, fertility symbols. Lust, we get the word stud from animals, like that. He's made of gold, and he has a horn, which is reminiscent of power. In the Hebrew symbolism, the most powerful land animal that they knew was the bull, right? It could gore a bear to death, it could stop things. And so the symbol of the bull, the horn, became a symbol of strength, a human symbol. So God, you'll hear in the Psalms and stuff, my horn is exalted. If you read the Bible or you listen, you'll find out the word horn occurs a lot. I will uphold the horn of David, and if you've ever seen Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses, if not, Google it and look at it close, pull up the head. He has 2 little horns sticking out of his head. So a horn is the image of power, right? It's lust, greed, power. Those are the 3 same things that all sin flows from. So the golden calf wrecks it. Well, the covenant is healed 40 years later, and they're allowed to enter the promised land. They've sort of reached the next stage. King David is made king, And then Solomon inherits the throne, and it looks as if this Davidic promise of the kings going all the way down to eventually, bring peace and Eden back to the world, it's all centered on Solomon. And the first part of Solomon's life starts out great. He's known for his wisdom. Notice that, wisdom. Then all of a sudden, one by one, he begins to break the laws of the kings. In the book of Deuteronomy, 4 laws are actually given to kings. One is to keep the Torah and read it daily. So he did do that in the beginning, but then later he doesn't. And then there are 3 laws that a king of Israel must never multiply certain things. You must never multiply your wives, right? The whole lust issue. You must never multiply your wealth. You're already the most prominent person in the kingdom. You don't need to exacerbate it even more. And you don't multiply your horses. Now that one on the surface, we may not know why that's a big deal. Horses were not rode in that time. There's no stirrups. People didn't ride horses. Horses were used for chariots, war, power. So it's the same 3. You're not going to give in to lust of the body. You're not going to give in to greed. And you're not going to give in to the desire for power. And little by little, Solomon breaks all 3. He goes, not only does he get horses, he buys them from Egypt to add insult to injury, right, where they were freed from. He has 1,000 wives and concubines.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, he really went crazy on that one. This one bad, a little worse by the time he got here. That's why there's a phrase, I think it's the book of, yeah. In the book of Proverbs, which is out of Solomon's time period, whether he literally wrote it is probably doubtful. He may have wrote sections of it. Instead, like David, he was a patron of people of wisdom, so he promoted that. But there's a great proverb in the book of Proverbs that sounds really bad. It still is bad even after, but at least you understand it later. He says, 1 man in 100 I have not found worthy, but not even 1 woman in 1,000. Ah. But it's a literal, speaking of his life.
Off with his head.
Yeah. And then the wealth, he raises, we're told, 666 talents of gold is the amount he charged Gentiles to worship in the temple, that before he told God he would let anyone worship the God of Israel. He's the first Antichrist. That's where the number comes from. 666 is from Solomon. So Solomon fails. And what happens after Solomon's failure? The kingdom is split, never to return again. So see, in each section, at creation, at the covenant with Israel, at the time of the king, the messianic king and his dynasty falls apart. And so on and so forth. And then we get to Jesus, and when we come to Lent, this is exactly what happens to him. Satan only has 3 tricks, but they work so well for him, he's never had to develop other ones. Because what does he first test? Turn the stones to bread, right? Fulfill a physical thing. No, I won't. I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world in their magnificence, right? That phrase, in their magnificence, really ties it back to Eden, the glitteringness, the beauty, all the gold and wealth. And he refuses. And then he says, throw yourself from the temple. Again, you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, the idea being, show them your power. If you leap from the temple and you don't die because you float down, because the angels hold you up, then they're going to believe in you. Right? Each thing is a way to make Jesus fall away from what humanity is supposed to be like. Trusting in God, not trusting in the kingdoms of the world, not sort of taking God at an advantage, but all these different ways. He's asking him to be a Messiah of a different sort. Notice the temptation. He's not saying don't be a Messiah. He's saying if you want to save the world, here's the way to do it, Jesus. Show them your power, then they'll follow you.
But didn't Satan know that Jesus was God?
Satan's exact knowledge of what was going on, we're not sure. I'm glad you brought that up, because it brings us to another passage. If you will, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul deals with the same issues that James is dealing with, but Paul devotes a lot more length to the idea of Christian wisdom. So, right from the very first chapter, and especially in chapters 2 and 3, he begins to give us some insight into certain things. The first thing he tells us is this. Starting with verses 10 through 17, he tells us that there's rivalries, disorder. In other words, it looks like James's church. Right? It's the same stuff. You've got factions, you've got divisions, you've got people claiming party sides. I'm for Apollos, I'm from Paul, I'm for Peter. And he says in the very last verse of that section, verse 17, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with the wisdom of human eloquence, but so the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its meaning." So he's beginning to make a distinction between the true wisdom, which is the cross, and this worldly wisdom. And he's very honest. Verse 18, "The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." But the cross makes no sense to people who aren't Christian. It's stupid. You believe in a guy as God who got executed? The sad part is, the irony that Paul's bringing out is, the whole time they think it's foolishness, they're dying in their sins. They're perishing. And they're looking at us, feeling sorry for us, and that we're idiots and fools, and yet we're being prepared for our salvation. And he says, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the learning of the learned I will set aside." Where is the one? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Right? How did James start his thing? "Who among you is wise and understanding?" See, they're even the same kind of idea, background of what's happening. He says, "Has not God made the wisdom of the world foolish?" And now he says something interesting. He says, "For since in the wisdom of God the world did not come to know God through wisdom." You notice that? Despite all our intelligence, all our knowledge, all our scientific and technological know-how nowadays, we can't come to know God. Why? Not because we're incapable, but it's something to do with our hearts don't want to do that. So while we claim knowledge, we're also at the same time ignorant. If you really want to see his big expression of that, it's Romans chapter 1, 18 through 32, right? He talks about how they were so wise, they were brilliant, but then they exchanged the wisdom of God, the Creator, for that of a creature. And you have all the Romans and Greeks who had this high and great philosophy, and yet they worshipped animals with bird heads and everything else, and human body parts. And he said, "How can you be so clueless and so wise? There has to be something else that's driving it that's not just knowledge." He says, "It was the will of God that the foolishness of the proclamation to save those who have faith. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, Jews and Greeks alike, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human foolishness, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." Now, he gives us two extremes that we want to avoid, not that we don't fall into them from time to time. In a sense, Paul says, you've got this continuum. In the middle is the true wisdom, and that's the cross. But then on one side of the equation, you have the philosophers, those who want to be able to explain everything in some rational way that human beings can grasp it. The Greeks look for wisdom. Their type of wisdom is not Hebrew wisdom. Their type of wisdom for the Greeks is knowledge. You can't know God. The best we can do with God is kind of make some generic principles about him apart from revelation. To try to make it all fit into human understanding is ridiculous. The infinite can't. St. John Chrysostom years ago said, we're like seeds in a pomegranate. The best we can see is the rind from the inside. What exists beyond the pomegranate itself, we have no way of ever touching. And that's God. He exists above the entire creation. He's in it too, but he doesn't exist as something we can put under a microscope or make an equation about. On the other hand, we have to be careful not to fall to the other side And that's kind of the almost superstition or fideism. Right? I want to be constantly uplifted by seeing miraculous things.
How do you spell fideism?
Fideism, F-I-D.
I know people like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's, there's nothing wrong with, just like there's nothing wrong with rationale in itself, right? The church uses it to the hilt in understanding. But we also realize ultimately we're understanding something that we only know anything about because he's revealed it to us himself. So we can now use our minds, which God gave us, to help to understand it. With the knowledge, we reach a line that just cannot be passed at some point. On the other hand, we have some people whose faith is, in a sense, really weak because it's necessary to always be filled with sort of miraculous things. We call them miracle hunters. Right? Oh, there's something here going on with Our Lady in this country. Let's go check out that apparition. Next, I'm over here at this one for this apparition. Then I come back here. St. Therese of Lisieux said, I prefer the monotony of faith. Right? Benedict Rochelle put it well one time. He said, I know people who have spent thousands of dollars to fly somewhere in the world where the Virgin Mother might have spoken to someone. He goes, those same people wouldn't take 10 minutes to walk across the street to the church and sit in the pew for an hour in front of the sacrament where we know Christ is present. He didn't have anything against apparitions. So I'm not saying that. What he had, though, was a problem with putting secondary things in place of primary ones. Right? Don't major in the minors. Devotions are wonderful. They help us express our faith, but devotions are not the faith. They're not the faith. When you get to heaven, God's going to have questions that aren't going to be about specifically what devotions you practice. It's going to be more in depth. You know, did you trust in me? Did you show your faith? All these kind of things. And so you have to be careful between the ones both sides you have to be careful with. It's not, again, when you enter into discussions with these people, like Paul says, you know their faith is weak. It may not look like it. They may look like their faith is really strong, but it's not. That's why they need constant, oh, there really is something. There really is something. There really is something. So really it comes from a weak faith. And so he says the one thing you don't do to people who are like that is you don't tell them it's all hooey, right? You don't say, oh, that's stupid. Like, are you kidding me? You don't say, hey, you just have weak faith, right? Because then what happens? Then they have no faith. And that's certainly what we don't want. So you have to just deal, listen to their stories, another thing, and then maybe pray for them, help them get other avenues where they can sort of learn the deeper truths, the more important things of our faith. Similarly with these ones, you don't just sort of cast it off because you can't rationally prove God. Let them keep delving into their stuff. But help them again. You don't want to, it's rather better that they're there than they have nothing. But the point Paul's trying to make is the cross, both sides can't deal with it. Because this is always looking to be uplifted in faith by these miraculous things and images of power and authority and majesty. I mean, that's what miracles do. And the cross tells us, it's a lot different than that, the spiritual life and the spiritual journey. And philosophy wants to uplift our knowledge and how we do things and understand things. It's very high and exalted, if used correctly as philosophy should be. And yet Jesus' experience shows us, no, it's right here down to earth. That was Abraham Heschel, a famous Jewish scholar. He would talk about, when you read the Bible, you're in a different world than Plato and Aristotle. Right? You read Plato and Aristotle, and it's all about ideals and forms and these great things that we can discuss philosophically. And then you turn to the Bible, and it's all about widows and orphans and poor people and how are you serving them. Right? It's a whole different world. Because what's important to God is what's down in real human life, the nitty-gritty, not the nice mansions in our minds we've created about what human beings could be like or things like this. He wants to deal with what is. So both sides are sort of brought up with this wisdom of the cross, kind of catches them. Then in verses 26 through 31 of chapter 1 of Corinthians, he again is connected to James here when he makes the contrast between the wealthy and the poor. He says, "Consider your own calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise by human standards," right? None of you were philosophers. "Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth," right? Most of you are poor. Slaves, women, sort of the lesser alienated people of your society. But that's not an accident, he's going to tell them. He says that's always been the case since the time of the Torah. "Rather, God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised of the world," that's the poor, "to shame those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something," the rich and powerful. "It is due to him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom of God." And then he mentions this. He says, getting more to the specific question we were asked about Satan. He says, "When I came to you, brothers, proclaiming the mystery of God," this is chapter 2, verse 1, "I did not come with sublimity of words or of wisdom. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and much trembling, and my message and my proclamation were not with persuasive words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of spirit and power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God." So it's interesting. The way of the cross is one of weakness, demonstration, this kind of thing. It's not on high philosophy and these other things. Notice I was weak, fear, trembling. It's all part of the cross. But then he mentions something. He says, verse 6, "Yet we do speak a wisdom to those who are mature." Notice, who are mature Christians. Real briefly, let's jump down to chapter 3 just so you can see where he's going. He says, "Brothers, I could not talk to you as spiritual people, but as fleshly people, as infants in Christ. I fed you milk, not solid food, because you were unable to take it. Indeed, you are still not able even now, for you are still of the flesh. While there is jealousy and rivalry among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving in an ordinary human way?" A person who is Christian but still ruled by the world's values, that's what Paul's talking about. You're fleshly. You still live in this world. That's why I can't even feed you the gospel. I have to give you little tastes of milk because you can't handle it. And he goes, but like James, what's his show that they're not there yet? Because there's rivalry. They're acting jealousy, rivalry. Right? It's the same things that James said. When you're acting this way, you're not a mature Christian. And therefore, you don't even get that there's a wisdom of God. You think in other words, you're living in the world and thinking you're doing your great Christian value. You're missing it. So what do the mature know? What is the wisdom they know? Back to verse 6. "We do speak a wisdom to those who are mature, but not a wisdom of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away." Now, Paul uses a lot of these phrases. So does James. Polyvalent. Polyvalent means that the word has various meanings. So when Paul says the rulers of this age, who do you think he means?
Satan.
He means Satan. He also means, however, the human authorities who follow his will. Right? Who crucified the Lord? Satan. Right? Satan induced Judas to do what he does. But who actually crucified him? The Romans, with the asking of the chief priests, all the leaders, the powerful, the rulers. So Paul means both. Paul means both. The rulers of this age, right? Because this age is under the influence of the god of this world. But those human rulers still make their own decisions. It's not like they're pawns in the sense that they can't choose otherwise. They've just so imbibed the way of the fallen one in the world that they're not going to. So he says, it's not a wisdom they speak. Rather, we speak God's wisdom, mysterious, hidden, which God predetermined for the age before the ages for our glory. And now look at verse 8, because it's an important one to what the question was. What does Satan know? "And which none of the rulers of this age knew, for if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." Now, it doesn't answer the specific question. Did Satan know Jesus was God? We don't know. Do we know he knows he was the Messiah? Definitely. Definitely. But Satan is so clueless as to the wisdom of God that he did exactly what God knew he would do because he was true to himself. I'm going to put the Messiah down, you're going to kill him, and once you kill him, you destroy yourself. Right? Paul seems to imply if they just let him live, they probably would have been fine. How many people would he have influenced then? Died some quiet life, 60 years old or something, passed away, another rabbi. See, one thing about the angels is this, and recall this just very briefly. Paul is the one who tells us, although it's throughout all the Old and New Testament, there are 3 heavens. Paul talks about the first, second, and third heaven. He says, I was caught up to the 3rd heaven, and you have the heavens of the heavens, and the Lord is in the highest of the heavens. The first heaven, all these words, all these places are the same term in Hebrew is used for heaven, what we translate heaven. The first heaven, though, is really just the universe, starting with our sky and going outwards. And we still use that term sometimes, right? We'll say, I look into the heavens, astronomy. So, but that's this world, that's creation. The 3rd heaven is the heaven where God is present in a unique way. Of course, God is present everywhere. But when we talk about heaven in a spiritual sense, like where are the angels, where are the saints, where do we go after death, etc. Heaven, 3rd heaven. What's the second one? The second heaven was the place of the angels, the spiritual beings, right? Just like we material/spiritual beings have a material world, they existed in an existence we don't know of. Now, they too were tested, and the catechism is clear. Other than affirming they were tested, the Bible tells us nothing about the nature of that test. So don't even bother to speculate. We don't know what the test of a spiritual being would be like. We do know, however, that those who failed the test then remained here or were cast down into this universe, where the ones who passed the test now pass into God's real presence, his total presence, and experience him, and those are now the holy angels. Now what does that mean? That means that however the angels experienced God prior to the test was clearly different than how we do. Nevertheless, it was not perfect. They did not know God. The holy angels do now. They know God. The fallen angels fell before they ever experienced the beatific vision. They do not know the plan of God. They don't understand it. In fact, they can't even experience, as far as we know, the deepest spiritual experiences like joy. So, for example, one of St. Ignatius of Loyola's things on discernment, and one that John of the Cross also brings out. Because Satan has never experienced joy, he's never seen the Lord face to face. Because of that, he doesn't know what it's like. So the best he can do is give you physical pleasure and hope that it tricks you enough to think you're experiencing something spiritual joy. He can't do otherwise. He doesn't know how. So exactly what specific parts he knew about the Trinity and everything else and Jesus' incarnation, we don't know with any we don't know. But we do know he clearly didn't know the general plan. He had no idea what God's plan was. But that's true even of the other angels, because in Ephesians, I think it's Ephesians, if I can find it quick, I'll turn to there. But in Ephesians, when Paul talks about the church, he, I can't find it right now, but he talks about that even the angels learned the plan from the church. Like even the holy angels didn't know, God didn't share with them what he was going to do. They didn't grasp it entirely. Either way, so what did Satan know? We don't know. We know he definitely knew he's the Messiah. We know he's the chosen one of God. Did he recognize his divinity? Maybe. It's hard because terms that later on we apply to always meaning something divine did not mean that in the time of Jesus. So even the term son of God was not a term of divinity. It was the term for the Jewish Davidic king, or all the sons of God. And similarly, when they call him the Holy One of Israel, the fallen angels, when they're cast out, that's another title. It doesn't necessarily signify divinity. It only becomes clear that it's divinity in the resurrection and when he sends the Spirit. That's why during the time of his own life, Jesus himself kind of played with that and made it confusing, right? I'm the Son of Man. What does that mean? Because it just means human. I'm the Son of Man. Son of Man means a human being. But then Son of Man in one and only one place in the Bible doesn't mean that. And that's in Daniel, when he receives the power of God. But Jesus is just confusing, right? He never just comes out and says it until he's asked to, right? When the high priest says, "Who are you? Are you the Messiah?" Even then he says, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "Yes." Whether even the high priest believed that he was literally divine is probably stretch, But he did claim to be the Messiah. And not only that, he claimed to be the final Messiah, because he quotes Daniel, and you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, right? And that's when the priest rips his clothes and said, "Well, we've all heard it. He's a blasphemer." He says he's the one who's going to possess God's power. So Satan's wisdom, what he knows, he doesn't have a clue. Satan has to draw everything he has. Yes, whenever we're talking about angels, we're guessing a lot, but the church has come to understand that the angels have intellects that are probably vastly superior to ours. Probably. We don't know for sure. But they tend to be intelligent beings. Satan can't be everywhere. He's not omniscient, and he's not omnipotent, and he's not, all places. So because of that, Satan has to basically go by his understanding and experience of human nature to tempt us. So for example, when you are praying in your mind, just you, Satan cannot hear what you're saying. He can't be in your mind and suddenly know what you're saying to God. He has no ability to do that. All he can do is watch your actions, and over time, he'll become very certain of, if he throws a certain incident at you or a certain person, he knows how you're going to react, most likely. But that's all from him watching. When it comes to the interior of your heart, he knows nothing. The church says even in a possession, the spirit remains untouched by the evil one. He can't enter there. He's unable to. He doesn't have that power. So Satan's always, to an extent, operating at a disadvantage. His advantage comes from the fact that he's watched us, or his demons have, over our lifetime, and so he knows exactly what buttons to push, better than our own families, right? He knows exactly what your problems are going to be.
Then how come during exorcisms, the priest can call out the spirit? Or identify that spirit?
But how does that
What
change?
spirit are you? And the spirit will acknowledge.
Right, its name itself.
Exactly.
But the spirit can't enter into a person's spirit.
I gotcha, okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank
They can influence the mind from
Yes.
inside. They can influence even the body, and that's
Yes.
more likely. They can't enter into the depths of the spirit. Even in our fallen human nature, that's impossible. We can only give them control over the parts, because we can't even control our spirit. So we can
Yes.
give them control and access to whatever we can do. So,
Thanks.
okay. So Jesus breaks the authority, the power. And you'll notice that the way that Catholic spirituality is built up, whether you realize this or not, I know you guys do because you've heard me talk about it like 100 times, but each of these types of sin has a specific way a virtue that opposes it and a specific action. So when it comes to lust, or the physical ones, sins that are of the body, we call them, then the virtue to have is chastity. Now, chastity is always dependent upon vocation. So the chastity of an unmarried person, or a person in a religious order, or a priest, their chastity is different than a married man or woman. Chastity for a married man or woman obviously involves sexuality. It doesn't for the others. it's going to be, with the one spouse faithfully for life, those kind of things. But don't let the word chastity throw you off that that's only for certain people. Chastity just means having a pure heart and approaching other people with that respect and seeing them with that dignity as the image of God. Right? Think back to Eden. They saw each other, but they had no clothes, but they weren't ashamed. Right? It's not just physical nakedness, it's we see each other. And because of that, when I see this, the action I can take is to fast. And we'll take fasting in a broad sense here. Fasting is being able, through my grace and willpower, to say no to certain things, whether they're good or bad. The bad things, definitely, I fast from them entirely, but even good things from time to time I will fast from, just in order to learn how to control and set my own life in order. And so I start this discipline, and I start at the lowest area, my body, which is the easiest part to control. Similarly, when we come to wealth and gold and those kind of things, now simplicity, for religious it's called poverty, but simplicity for lay people is not being ostentatious, living only with what you need, enjoying what you have, not necessarily needing to amass things. And that's where the action of almsgiving comes from. So I oppose greed by not only do I not gather things to myself covetously, but I voluntarily and cheerfully. Remember Paul, God loves a cheerful giver, not a grumpy one. I give of my own wealth to others, freely, not because I have to or anything else, I want to. Finally, the last one, I practice obedience. Right? I recognize that it's not all about me, and despite I know a lot about myself, I maybe don't know as much about myself or what will bring me happiness or joy or any of these things, and so I surrender or submit myself to the Lord. And the practice that goes along with that is prayer. Prayer opposes power because real prayer is the very act of placing myself in the presence of God in order to hear his voice, presumably to follow it. Right? In the way of the world, like a fleshly Christian that Paul talks about, the fleshly Christian is going to do everything they can in their power to solve their problem. And then when it still looks insoluble, the last thing, literally the last thing they'll do is this. Well, I guess I'll try to pray about it too.
Yeah.
Last thing, not first. And so they don't really even expect that it's going to happen, right? The way they approach it shows that they don't really put it, because they're not really people of obedience. So you put it before prayer, before God, and while you're doing that, you also work towards what you need. You don't just sit around and do nothing. The original phrase for the Benedictines, it's still their motto, was ora et labora, prayer and work. And then Ignatius of Loyola, who much like the Franciscans, he wanted his order to be out in the world. And so obviously you couldn't live the same lifestyle that the monks do in their structured community. But he extended the word for us who are lay people. He says, pray for everything depends on God. Work as if everything depends on you. But you first put it forth in that prayer as the first thing, not the last resort that maybe it'll happen if God sees fit to do it, because it already shows a lack of real faith or trust on your part, that God either will or even can possibly, bring about whatever it is that you need in life. And so you have these three things that are going on. Now, the power of these things has been broken. So Christ has broken those things. And because we've been given his Spirit, or the implanted word, as James puts it, we always have access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We are always in constant contact with the Lord and the Spirit. They're there. They're with us. And so because of that, it's not that we're not going to have these desires and lusts. We're going to. And we're going to even fail to fight against them sometimes. Nevertheless, though, so long as we still maintain that relationship, repenting when we need to, continuing to struggle, to try to build virtue, to try to learn and come to know the Lord more clearly, the more these things become nuisances, but they don't define our life. The only way these can begin to define your life again is basically if you give them the authority they once held over you before you were baptized. That once you do that, and I give in to, gluttony and lust and I just continue to build on that, well now the hold that God has on me is threatened. Not because he doesn't have the power to hold it up, but you're letting go. You don't want him there anymore. And so because of that, John still warns us that we have to be careful. And so in John 2:15, 1 John 2:15, he just very briefly, I mentioned this before, he says, 1 John 2:15, he says, do not love the world or the things of the world, is how it starts. But he mentions the same three things. So 1 John 2:15, he says, do not love the world or the things of the world. It's exactly what James is going to see in 4:4. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Verse 16, for all that is in the world, sensual lust, so that's the first one, enticement for the eyes, and the pretentious life is not from the Father, but is from the world. Yet the world and its enticement are passing away. Whoever does the will of God remains forever. So we can't sort of relax ourselves. Yes, they don't control us, but if we begin to get sloppy and lazy in our spiritual life, not really praying regularly, I'm not really trying to live out the gospel, those things start making inroads back in quickly, and they'll take hold of you worse than you had it before. Right? It's like an addict who goes a long time sober and then falls again. The fall is usually worse than when they first started their sobriety. And Jesus tells us that. He goes, you'll have a demon that's cast out. He's making a general statement about evil and such. He goes, I'll cast out a demon, and it'll be swept clean. But then sometime later, 7 demons will come back. They'll see the place is empty, and they'll come in, and the man's last condition will be worse than his first. Right? We give up these things, but then if we let them come back into our lives, they're going to rule over us even more powerfully than they ever did before. And so that's why James warns us. Don't be stupid. The one who is in you is greater infinitely than the one who is in the world. Christ, there is no comparison with Satan. One's the infinite Lord of all. One's a created being. However, the more we seek to kind of pull ourselves away from his protection, to leave his light, to move back into this other world, the more problems we're going to find ourselves experiencing. And so what de Montfort did is he looked at what James said, and de Montfort, having this whole background in his mind, on page 1 of the little handout I gave you, he explains what each of these terms means, what these types are. I can only mention them because we're out of time, but he says earthly wisdom is excessive striving for worldly goods, creating a deep attachment. You spend most of your time attempting to become wealthier, asserting your rights in court all the time, focusing all your words, thoughts, and deeds on the acquisition of temporal goods. If you're religious, you receive the sacraments and pray only carelessly, in a very offhand manner, once in a while, for the sake of appearance. So that corresponds to the flesh. So he tells us that this first one is actually what we call the flesh elsewhere. And that's the first type of evil wisdom. Then the second type is unspiritual, refers to the lustful desire. This is the flesh. You know what? We'll just stop. Before I get too confused, it's time to leave anyway. I'm going to confuse myself. Just so you guys know, it doesn't generally affect you, but some people move back and forth. Just so you're aware, next Monday, although the church is closed, I still have the Monday Bible study. Like I said, it doesn't affect you guys, but they voted that they wanted it to still go on. Veterans Day, because most people are done with their partying by 6:30, right? So just if for some reason you're one of those people who move around, or someone asks you who you know who goes but doesn't come on Wednesday, even though the church is closed, we'll be here for for Veterans Day. So let's go ahead and end in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we ask you, the giver of all good gifts, to grant us the grace of charity. Let us experience firsthand, in our very being, Lord, how much you love each and every one of us uniquely. For your love is not generic. It's not in any way just philosophical, or it is always unique, concrete, and personal. For being infinite, you can love each and every one of us infinitely, perfectly, individually, in a unique manner. So let us experience that love, Lord. So experiencing that love and knowing your love for us, seeing Christ on the cross given for us, knowing the depths of your love, we can trust in you. And then learning to trust in you, Lord, will be inspired, encouraged, and desire to please you more by doing the concrete works of loving service that you asked of us. And in doing so, we're not just serving others, but serving ourselves, because the more we act like Christ, united with your grace and the Spirit in us, the more we do become conformed to Christ and experience the peace, love, joy, and all the other gifts you have awaiting for us. We experience them even now, and they will only get greater as we experience and draw closer to your kingdom. So Lord, give us the gift of discernment. Help us see when we're starting to slip into the wisdom of the world in our actions and thoughts and desires. Give us the courage to live out the gospel and the courage to also look honestly at ourselves, to repent when we need to. And give us that wisdom and knowledge that you say you will give freely to all who ask, that we do know the wisdom of the cross, that we embrace it, that we follow it, and that we serve as Christ to one another, and then as a church to those outside of our walls. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Okay, have a good week, you guys.